Hopefully you're able to see the screen now, and good morning to all of you and welcome. As Alice has introduced this session, I'm not going to go over those details again, but I am just going to touch on the fact that the topic that we're covering today, for some of us, could be quite an emotional topic. It could touch us in places where perhaps we weren't even expecting to be touched as we listen to and think about some of the issues around love and loss, and not least in relation to dementia. So I'm just going to give you, if I may, a little health warning. Please be kind to yourself and look after yourself. And if at any point during the session you feel emotionally that you're struggling, you are of course very welcome to perhaps turn off your camera, at worst to leave, but we hope you wouldn't without letting someone else, perhaps Alice or Sam, know that you're finding it difficult. It's really good that you're all able to be here, and we can see that we've got quite a cross section of people here today, and geographically as well as in terms of your particular life experiences. So I thought I'd start with this quote this morning. It's one that you may be familiar with. "It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." In one of Tennyson's poems, he says that. I wonder whether you agree. And then another quote from a more recent writer. "The risk of love is loss, and the price of loss is grief. But the pain of grief is only a shadow when compared with the pain of never risking love." This morning's webinar is framed around 5 questions that I would like us to consider together. And 2 of those questions will be particularly explored in our breakout groups, which I hope you will feel able, if you can, to contribute to, although you don't need to, you can sit quietly and listen, of course. But I'm hoping that as we unravel this topic together, that we will find things that will be helpful for ourselves and also perhaps for others that we are particularly supporting at the moment. So question 1, this is the first question. Can anyone who feels love avoid feeling loss? And I've deliberately opened with a very broad question this morning, because I believe it's the very nature of being human, and it's a God-given response to love and loss that we will feel, that we will experience emotion. Words that we sometimes use in relation to loss include such words as grief, grieving, bereaved, bereavement. And I thought I'd share a definition that I found in a dictionary of the word bereave. So here it speaks as origins in Middle and Old English, and some of the definitions here are to deprive of, to take away by violence, to seize, to rob. Our capacity to love, that is to feel affection for another, is mirrored, I think, by our sense of sadness when we lose that beloved. In part, the way we deal with loss, grief, will depend on the way that the loss happened. But of course, each of us is a unique and a complex person, and our responses will also be controlled by numerous other factors, many of them deeply buried in our subconscious. But if I may just use some of these definitions that we have here of the word bereave. In some cases, it may be that we simply feel deprived of the other person. Maybe it's somebody who has lived to a good age, as we might consider, and with whom we had the opportunity to process together the inevitability of that loss, of their death. Of course, we will naturally feel sad, we will be bereft, but maybe our ability to move through that time of grieving may be easier than, say, when someone is taken from us through a sudden death, perhaps. In other situations, such as a person having a stroke or some other debilitating illness, we may perhaps even feel robbed of that person. This emotion is sometimes described by those whose loved one develops a form of dementia. That sense of being robbed of the person we have known and of that relationship in its fullness that we have developed over many years. But in all cases, I suggest that the reason that we feel grief is because love will inevitably bring us to that time of loss that cannot and will not be simply shrugged off with a, oh well. It will touch us deeply, won't it? So in this respect, I thought this morning I'd like us to consider the second question, which will be coming up on the screen now, and we'll be doing this together in a moment in our small groups. Not quite yet. But what I hope we may be able to do as we consider this question, what are the losses that cause you the most grief? That you might reflect on your life so far and of situations and incidents that have caused you that sadness and grief. And I have to say, it may not be the loss of a person. Some of us are very attached to our pets, for example, and I'm sure sometimes a loss of a pet can touch a person very deeply. Some of us become, rightly or wrongly, attached to possessions, particular things, maybe because of their emotional value. And if it gets broken or stolen or we just lose it, that can cause us distress and grief. And yes, of course, relationships. It might be a relationship that's ongoing, or it might be someone that we have loved and have lost through death. And what I'm going to suggest before we go into the groups, just for a moment, to say to you, if you have a pad or a piece of paper nearby, it might be worth jotting down any such losses that you're thinking about at the moment, because there may be more than one, and there may be more than would be time to discuss in the breakout room in a moment. So then you can come back to them later on in your own time, maybe, to reflect on how those losses have affected you and how you feel about them. Well, I know it's fairly brief, but I hope it helped you to make a start in thinking together. And you know, in that sense, I hope it was of some help. I'm just going to make sure I'm on the right slide. It's the same slide. And so maybe any of the group facilitators, if there's anything you felt came out of that brief time that would be worth sharing with the rest of the group on this now, I would really be grateful for anyone to do that. So any of the needs to unmute facilitators, perhaps you do that now. Thank you.
I think in our group it was the losses that are unexpected or unplanned for, and we don't quite understand why they've happened, because it may be somebody very young who's died, or you know, it's about a breakdown of a relationship. We don't quite understand why that relationship is broken down. And the second one was about the loss of identity. Maybe somebody who has been a carer, and particularly with somebody for living with dementia, or you lose your identity as a professional, or as a person who goes out and goes to work and has a title, and you sort of lose colleagues and routine around that as well.
Thank you, Adam. Anyone else?
I say very easy, the same in the group that I was in, and it was the discussion by more than one person was about the difference in anger between a life that was robbed, not allowed to finish in a natural way, and a life that was still painful to come to an end of a term, but where the anger was different. But in all the people who spoke, more than one talked about anger.
Thank you, Duncan. That's really helpful as well. Yeah. Anyone else?
It was the same in our group. We talked about the various people that had been taken from us, husbands, mums, partners. And also when it happens at a young age, I mean, one of our group lost their mum age 15, which is pretty awful for a teenage girl to lose their mum. But it's also another lady lost her husband to dementia. And of course, in some stages of dementia, they forget who you are. And of course, that's a loss in itself, because they can't remember your name. And it's not just a loss, it really hurts. Another lady was talking about a family member who committed suicide. Well, that's awful. Again, it's not, well, it's not planned by the family. It might be planned by the one who actually commits suicide. but probably after, you know, a lot of thought and, you know, what can I do? But so those are a few of the losses we talked about in our group.
Thank you, Tony. That's really helpful as well. So we're covering quite a few, and there was one that came up in our group which I hadn't particularly ever thought of in this way, and it was really helpful, and it was the loss of dreams. That we make plans, don't we, in our minds. We dream about, oh, one day we'll do this, one day we'll do that, and often for various reasons those dreams are not realized, and that can hurt a lot. I don't know about you, but I've known people who got to retirement and they've made so many plans about the holidays they're going to go on and the things they're going to do, and then sadly one of them dies very quickly after that retirement. So I do think that that's another one, and thank you for the person who shared that with us. So to continue, this brings us on to our next question, and this is question 3, and that is, how does loss affect those caring for someone living with dementia? For those caring directly for a close relative living with dementia, as well as for those in the extended family and friends, there's likely to be quite a sense of loss well before the person dies. Sometimes technically, and for those of you who are professionals, you might well know this term well, and others might as well, sometimes this is classed as anticipatory grief. I'm not sure personally that's a helpful term, because as far as I'm concerned, I would say it is just grief. It is another aspect of grief, because grief is more than just about when a person dies, as we've just been exploring in that last breakout group. But of course, it will trigger all sorts of emotions and all sorts of reactions and responses within us. And so what I was hoping now is that we could reflect on how it particularly affects anyone who is living in that situation of caring for a loved one. And I've asked someone to come along today to speak about her own very personal experience of this. So at this point, I'm going to welcome Rachel Newton, who is with us today. And I got to know Rachel when her husband John became a resident at Horfield Lodge, when I was then one of the chaplains at Horfield Lodge. And we travelled together on that next and that final stage of the journey with Rachel, which was a great privilege for me. So I've asked Rachel if she would very kindly share with us her experiences of this loss that she experienced, and I'll leave her to actually start where she wants and to go through it in the way that she would best like to do that. So Rachel, may I hand over to you, please?
Thank you, Peter. I'm very conscious, I want to say first, that my experience and John's story was well before COVID pandemic, and therefore some of you will be going through very different things, and maybe this won't be relevant to you, but I hope there'll be something in John's story that you can pick up and talk about, and that will be useful for you. We haven't always lived in Bristol, but we chose to come back in retirement because we knew the city and we had friends here. That was in 1995. Before that, we lived in East Africa, London, and Liverpool. My husband was an ordained Methodist minister with a few degrees under his belt. He taught church history in Bristol and then Africa, and before retiring, he was the chair of the Liverpool Merseyside district and was made one of the 3 presidents of the Merseyside Assembly with Bishop David Shepherd and Archbishop Derek Warlock. Later, he was to become the first free church president of the newly formed Churches Together in England. I don't tell you this because I'm name dropping. I'm just showing you the kind of pressure that John was under. Up early, working late, frequently travelling down and back from Liverpool to London. 101 things. I worried that he might have a heart attack one day, but I never in my wildest dreams thought about dementia. John had a very keen intellect. He was a popular preacher and chosen by the other 2 to preach at the Hillsborough service in Liverpool Cathedral. He was a popular after-dinner speaker because he could be brief and he could also tell stories that made everybody laugh and hold the audience. Looking back, there were some odd signs of pressure on the memory, but I didn't know what I was looking for then and only thought of them later in the light of a diagnosis. We settled back in Bristol in our own home for the very first time after years of living in manses, and to John's delight, in a cottage opposite the medieval college in Westbury-on-Trim, older than Bristol, with the parish church and the Methodist church neighbours just round the corner. Retirement was not a rest, though, as John took up more duties and posts: warden of John Wesley's chapel, the new room, on the management of the nearby house of prayer, teaching again at Wesley College, where he'd been principal, and preaching all over the country. As I began to observe a little more in the way of memory loss, I suggested a visit to the doctor, and John came willingly. He answered questions with aplomb, and then the doctor said, well, to be sure, we'll just send you for a memory test and a scan. When I asked where that would be, the doctor said, I can't remember, and they both fell about laughing. Was I worried then? Only a little, naively not knowing very much about dementia, but setting myself to begin to find out. Monitoring changes in behaviour and memory loss, with one or two scary incidents making me even more worried. A lovely memory nurse used to come and visit us at home and couldn't get over the fact that John scored 29 out of 30 and knew her name every time. That was because she had the same name as a granddaughter. And as I told her afterwards, if it had been a Bible question instead of about cows in a field, he would have scored 100%. At first, we didn't do support groups. I didn't feel the need for it, and we muddled along. But then I began to request more help. And eventually we saw the dementia consultant for Bristol for a diagnosis. She was a lovely lady who completely put me at my ease on meeting her by saying that she actually knew John. So I didn't have quite so much explaining to do as I thought I might. She looked him full in the eye halfway through and said, I'm very sorry, but you have Alzheimer's. John never, ever used that word, and he didn't react to what she said, and he didn't talk about it afterwards. He just excused himself when he couldn't remember something by saying, well, I've got no memory, have I? That was a turning point for me and a very lonely feeling that I was going to have to cope with this by myself, obviously with family support, but I had to explain what Alzheimer's meant to the 4 boys who all took it in different ways. I began to feel stronger to ask for more help. And I met a wonderful woman from the Alzheimer's Society through a friend who helped me over a coffee sort out strategies and build a safety net. I was so fortunate to have really good friends who would give John a meal and give me time and eventually even stay overnight to let me have a break. I had my best and oldest friend as a bolt hole who brought Marmite toasties to me in bed and let me catch up on sleep. Coping with the change in personality was the most difficult, as this gentleman who'd spent a lot of time praying and writing in his garden study, helping other people, became loud and sometimes aggressive, embarrassing, and obsessed with babies and young children. I dreaded any visits to the surgery, as when the sliding doors open, he thought he had a captive audience and began to tell jokes. Sunday was also a hard day, as I would arrive at church at the last minute, having had a battle over clothes. John's Sunday clothes were a dark suit and a dog collar. Eventually I gave in and he chose, but I didn't appreciate coming into church and being asked by the one on duty, "How are you? How is John?" I didn't want to talk about it at that moment. I just wanted to sink into silence and prepare for worship. So that's a note for dementia-friendly churches to take in. Slowly, very slowly, John deteriorated, and he knew it, feeling angry and confused about himself. He wanted to help me because he realised I was having more to do, but helping with supper in a very small kitchen was not safe. I tried to give him things to do, but it all became more fraught and dangerous, and I became afraid of his physical strength. He was a big man. Eventually, I talked to a social worker who was suggesting that I might have more care at home and help. But as soon as I said, I don't feel safe and I don't feel I can keep him safe, then we were in a different world. He said, "That's enough, you don't need to say any more." And we were in the world of full-time care, and I was having to accept this. I think that's one of the hardest decisions ever, as many of you here will know, that you have to recognise the time when you have to hand over to professionals because you can't do it all yourself. I visited several care homes, but there was always something wrong. And it wasn't until I went to Horfield Lodge, which made the best impression. And of course, it was Methodist with chaplains on the team. So I put John's name down. On the day appointed, about which I'd got very worried as to how it would go, a lovely carer I knew took us in her car after packing John's suitcase with him. He thought he was going on holiday and that I was going into a room further down the corridor. We settled him in, and while carers distracted him with lunch, she and I went off for a coffee and I had a few tears. Then began 2 years of routine visiting, trying not to expect every day to be a good day, every visit to be a good visit, and never to talk about going home for me. Riding out the good with the bad and trying to keep a sense of humour. One day, we were in a circle in the lounge with several of the residents, and I looked at John and said, "Darling, you've got the wrong glasses on. Can you see through them?" "Yes, all right," he said. And over the other side of the circle, I could hear a daughter having a conversation with her mother about her glasses. I thought, I bet they've got the wrong ones. Anyway, we met in the middle of the circle to exchange glasses. And I just said to her, "Be thankful that it's not teeth." And she absolutely collapsed. And we shared it with the whole group and had a wonderful laugh. John was extremely good at crosswords and didn't lose the ability to hold 3 in his head clues at the same time and then tell me the answers. That was when he stopped reading them for himself, but his brain was such that he could take them in. He always read his New Testament in Greek, and there was a story about the book being lost, And when it was found, eventually they knew it belonged to John because there was nobody else who read the Greek. And when Peter sometimes asked him to pronounce the benediction at the end of a service, he became his old self with this wonderful voice. And that's what I hear in my head often. I recognised eventually that Alzheimer's was going to be the end of him. We coped with various effects of that on the family, the 4 boys and their wives and their children. And I began to rehearse in my mind sometimes ways of how John might end his life. I didn't want to get to the stage when he wouldn't know me. Those were difficult thoughts, but I felt I had to face them. But in actual fact, the way that it happened in the end was not any of those. It was at 3 o'clock in the morning with a massive heart attack, and I wouldn't have been there anyway. I was pleased to hear that he'd shared a sandwich with one of the carers and a joke before he died. Do I worry that, am I upset that I wasn't there at the last? I think because I'd handed him over to care, and I think because I knew there were people who would do the right thing at the end, I couldn't feel too much loss that I wasn't there personally. I'm just grateful to all those lovely carers. I want to say 3 things at the end to address any of you out there who are dealing with dementia. And the first is, be kind to yourself as a carer. You're no use to anybody if you're exhausted all of the time. And the second thing is to realise, without feeling guilty, that sometimes you have to hand over your loved one to professionals because they know what they're doing. And the third is, live each day, whether it's bad or good. Try to gauge the mood of your loved one and adjust accordingly. This is how it is today. And if it's not a very good day, go through the pain with them. Cry when you need to, ask for help, and unashamedly use your friends. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you so much for sharing that story with us. I expect there was quite a lot more you could have given to us as well, but obviously we are constrained by time today. But I'm sure we're all very grateful for you being able to help us to understand something of that journey that you went through with John. And I'm just going to add a little addenda, if I may, of my own, which is that I was very privileged to be able to be one of the chaplains around and supporting John and Rachel in those last couple of years. And that story that Rachel mentioned about giving the benediction, I just want to add a little bit more to that. There was one occasion when we were holding a service in what is basically an activities room, not usually used for services, but we would go in there. And the day I went in to set up for communion, he was sitting right where I needed to put the table for communion. He was asleep. Somebody said to me, one of the carers said, "Shall we wake him up and move him?" I said, "No, you don't." I put the table where I could, which was next to where John was sitting, and I sat the other side of the table. So we were there with the table between us. He was still asleep. I began the service, and I think I went through quite a bit of the service with John still very definitely asleep, and everyone sitting there with John and myself at the front, as it were. And then we were singing a hymn, and he woke up and he joined in with every word of that hymn without a hymn book in front of him, because of course we always use familiar hymns and John knew them all by heart. And then we got to the end, as I said, And I looked at John and I said, would you like to give the blessing, John? And he looked up, and of course, word perfect, he gave us a very lovely benediction. And yes, it was one of those moments. And I think what I would say to you all, and I'm going to sort of break at this point, and we're going to have a short 5-minute break. What I would say to you all is that there will be moments in our experience of loss when there will be something there that reminds us that we haven't lost the person, because they still remember so many special things. What we've lost perhaps is the ability to have that communication with them, which is so important, I know. Everybody's back. Is that right? Yeah, lovely. Well, I hope you found that helpful, folks. Do you know what? I don't know if I said this at the beginning. I said it to colleagues when we were chatting before the event started. This kind of event would normally been a day event, or I was saying it to Rachel, I think, this morning. You know, we'd have run a day conference on this, and that's what obviously this year might have been our theme for the conference that we might have held. So to do an hour and a half is not doing it justice. It may not even be giving you enough time to offer your own thoughts and your own contribution. It may not give you enough time maybe to process some of what you're hearing as well. And I apologize for that. But what I hope is that it's still giving us something. And there will be things happening beyond today, which I'll mention in a moment or two. But I just want to share my screen again and just reflect briefly on where we've got to with the situations that we've been discussing in our groups. When I can like that and do that. What I'm going to do in these last few minutes before we round off is I'm going to share what I call my top 10 tips. Tony's a great one for top 10 tips. That's where I got the idea from. And if you go, those of you who don't know already, the BDAA website, on there's a couple of lists of top 10 tips that have been put on there. So I'm pinching your idea, Tony, and I'm going to now offer my top 10 tips in relation to this fourth question: how does loss affect a person living with dementia? So what I wanted to just reflect on very quickly is when we come to telling a person with dementia that a loved one has died, which can be really hard. You know, somebody mentioned in our group that sometimes if a parent has died, they don't even remember that parent was you know, around, or that they've forgotten quite how it all works. So we're struggling all the time with, I've got some really bad news. How do I share that bad news with this person, or do I share it? So these are my top 10 tips, what they're worth. First of all, we need to consider when and how we share this, and indeed any other difficult information that we feel we need to share with them. Consider when we do it and how we do it. And really the second is the same as the first, really. We need to choose a good time, don't we? We need to think about, when is that person most relaxed? When are they most maybe comfortable? We need to think about the place. So, you know, we wouldn't do it at a time when we're in a hurry, when we're about to rush off somewhere. We wouldn't do it in a place that's noisy. If we can help it, we'll find somewhere quiet, and we'll do it so that the person feels safe. The third tip is one for you, and that is the need to realize that you may well be emotional about this loss. So for example, I'll give you an example. It may be that your person that you're supporting with dementia, that somebody very close to both of you has died. So it could be a sister, a sibling, it could be a parent or a spouse. So you're emotionally affected by it. And in a sense, it's going to be something you don't really want to talk about yourself anyway. But the danger then is that you think, well, I've got to get this over with. And the danger is that you rush. Try not to do that. What I always suggest people do is try and process as much for yourself beforehand, so that when you're actually sharing it with that person, if you like, dealt with your immediate grief yourself, your immediate emotions a little bit. As you're sharing something like this, it's important that you watch the other person and that you listen for any response, or watch for any response, because it may not be verbal. It may be you notice they're starting to shake a little, or you might see some other particular sign that tells you that they're getting distressed. That gives you a reason to think, I need to step back, or I need to step in for support. You might get some very strange responses to it. And that's why that you must try not to react if they respond inappropriately. I'm not saying you can help it, because reactions are reactions, but if you can, try and be aware that that could happen. And, oh, what am I going to do about this? Maintaining eye contact with the person, of course, is very important, and being ready if it's appropriate, and only you will know whether it's appropriate to offer a physical comfort of some kind, whether it's a hand held out to touch theirs, or whether it's an arm around the shoulder, or whether it's a hug, or whatever. Only you will know whether that's appropriate, but be ready to do that if it's needed. But I guess 7 is one that already will have come up in some of your conversations, I'm imagining. Don't be surprised if they don't show emotion, because we were talking about the fact that because of the part of our brain that gives us that sense of emotion is often affected by dementia, it may well be they won't show any emotion. And some people are surprised by that, but of course, if we know that, then we shouldn't be surprised. As I said just now, you'll be watching for signs of whether this is too distressing, so you might need to be prepared to stop and to try again at another suitable time. I would suggest that you always think about what afterwards. So again, and particularly in situations where you're going into the situation where you're not living with that person, whether they're living in residential care or whether they're living with another member of your family and you've gone to break some news, make sure that they are safe. If possible, stay with them as long as you can, or make sure there are others who are aware of the situation who can support them afterwards. And of course, they may not remember, so you need to be ready to possibly share it again. Although in our conversation in our breakout group, it was suggested that there comes a point where you think, I have shared it, it was distressing for that person, maybe I won't rush to share it again because I don't want to cause undue distress. And that's always a difficult one. So we're on to the final question. And this is about resources. Are there ways that we can support those who are feeling loss? And some of you will know of places you can go for support and for advice and for good resources that support you. I put on here on this screen just a few of the organisations. First of all, there's the Bristol Dementia Action Alliance. Tony and Sam very involved with that, and their website has got lots of very good resources, including that featured item there, which is a resource pack that we as a group prepared over a number of years, which is called Becoming a Dementia Friendly Church. Within that, there are going to be things that will be helpful in relation to this particular thing, but beyond that, there's the group itself that Alice introduced, and if you ever want to get in touch with them, you've now got some email contacts that you can get back to them. The Alzheimer's Society, and I know we've got folk here who are actually involved working for them as well, they've got so many resources on their website, which are really worth looking at. Cruise also as a bereavement care organisation. But what I wanted to just say at this point, if I may, is that we're going to provide you with a resource sheet, a fact sheet. But what we thought we'd do, rather than giving it to you now, is I'm going to say to you, you might know of organisations or resources that would be helpful. So what I'm going to ask is, after this event, if you do feel that you know of something that could be useful, would you mind emailing it? To who's the email contact that people would be using? Can I just check with my colleagues on that?
And they can use mine, Peter.
Thank you, Sam.
Do you want me to give it?
Yes, please.
office@bdaa.org.uk.
And Sam, would you mind putting that in the chat as well, please, so that they've got it there if they want to copy it down. Thank you. So please, if you've got some thoughts, send them through to us. And what we'll then do, we'll perhaps give it a week or two, then we'll put together a fact sheet of all those suggestions and we'll email it out to you if you'd like it, so that you've got something that might be of some use to you in the future. Well, can I first of all say thank you very much. We're not finished yet, by the way, so don't go if you can stay, please. But can I just say thank you very much for coming, and I've really enjoyed, if I can put that word, but it's been a privilege to be able to share some stuff with you. I think I'm going to now hand over to Adam, who is going to close our time together.
I think just before we close in prayer, a few thank yous. A particular thank you to you, Peter, for giving us a framework to work through for today, and not just for sharing with us today, but for all the preparation that you put into it. It's been really good to have you with us again. Rachel, thank you so much for having the courage to share your story in such a moving way.
Yeah.
You know, we're very grateful to you for that. I think thank you to Alice and Sam, who have done all the behind the scenes technology with bookings and keeping us on track and breakout room today. So thank you very much, and to those who have shared in hosting the breakout groups. So a brief prayer, and then I'll end. Just before COVID really was doing a monthly worship in a dementia home, and always ended with the same blessing. So I will end with that blessing as well. So let us pray. Loving God, we thank you for the privilege of being together this morning in this way. We thank you for all that we have shared as individuals and all that other people have shared with us, that it may better equip us to share in the care and support of those living with dementia and their carers, in our families, in our streets, in our church family. Amen. So may God bless you. May God bless all those you love and all those who love you. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.